D-Day dodgers out in Italy, always drinking vino, always on the spree. 8th Army skivers and the Yanks, we live in Rome, we laugh at tanks, for we're the D-Day dodgers in sunny Italy.
In the summer of 1944, British troops in Italy were accused of shirking the war effort. MP Nancy Astor claimed that they were having a paid holiday, while the real fighting was going on in Normandy. The men in Italy should have been bitter, but most were too tired to care. They'd just spent 4 months throwing themselves against an extraordinary German defensive position for a questionable victory. They'd toiled up mountainsides, baked by the sun and buffeted by wind and snow. They'd forded freezing rivers and marched through miles of mud. Italy was anything but a holiday. It was always a controversial campaign. After victory in North Africa, the Allies were split over where to attack Fortress Europe. Churchill finally persuaded the Americans to keep up the pressure on the Germans in Italy. The Allies swept through Sicily and on to the mainland. The demoralized Italians surrendered soon after the first troops landed. It looked like being a short campaign. But Italy is a cruel country for invaders. Sheer mountains form its spiny backbone. Rivers block the line of advance. For the young men sent to fight here, it was a punishing place that would push them to the limits of their endurance.
It was unbelievable. Always raining or snowing or sleeting. One was permanently sopping wet.
German open fire, everything they had they put on us. Artillery, machine guns, everything. It was like being in the middle of lightning.
And then the machine gun bullets sweeping over one's head, and sometimes, of course, not always over the head. We lost a lot of men.
The Germans made the Allies struggle for every mile. The advance stopped at Cassino. On the 15th of January 1944, weary soldiers of the Fifth Army dislodged the Germans from the top of this mountain, Monte. They'd fought all the way up from the south, and the last 7 miles alone had cost them 16,000 casualties. As the men hauled themselves up to the crest, they must have been appalled by what they saw across the valley. The Germans were snug, in an apparently impregnable defensive position. They had complete mastery of the road to Rome, which ran up the center of this valley. To advance north, the Allies would either have to make a dash through the gap or storm the mountain strongholds. The worst of the Italian campaign was still to come. Surveying the whole scene was a great monastery, which would become the haunting symbol of the war in Italy, Monte Cassino.
It was such a vast building, and it dominated everything. And it did have that slightly eerie feeling of looking at you the whole time.
It seemed as though it was looking down on you because it was in such an overpowering position up there.
The clouds broke suddenly, and you could see the monastery 5 miles away, perched up on the top of this incredible cliff, dominating everything.
It was here that Hitler's commander in Italy made a stand for the winter. Field Marshal Kesselring, nicknamed Smiling Albert, created a formidable blockade that stretched across Italy from coast to coast. He called it the Gustav Line. The Germans blasted bridges and roads to slow down the Allied advance. They felled hundreds of trees to improve their observation. And they mined the whole area. Particularly repellent was this vicious little shoe mine. It's made of wood with just the minimum of metal parts to make it hard to find with a mine detector. It contains just enough explosive to blow off a man's foot. The cruel logic of this was that a crippled soldier imposed far more of a burden on his own side than a dead one. There were thousands of these scattered all around Cassino.
They made the best use of every bit of rock, of cranny, of caves, and they knew the tracks which we had to use, and they covered all those tracks, both with machine gun fire and shelling as well.
The Germans dug themselves deep into the hillside.
Unless they got a direct hit, they were safe down in these tunnels.
German ingenuity improved on nature on the slopes above Cassino. This artificial cave is still littered with the fins of British mortar bombs. But the cave is so cunningly sited, scooped into the very back of a ridge, that there was just no chance of these being fired into it. The Germans even had the weather on their side. January 1944 brought one of the worst Italian winters that locals could remember. The advance foundered in the mud.
At night it was dark, cold, wet and miserable. We had no cover of any kind. Of course, there were no things like tents or anything.
It was either snowing or blowing or raining, and it was a very, very cold time.
The interminable misery of life on the front line was a world apart from the more measured pace of Allied headquarters. The Allied commander-in-chief in Italy was a British officer, General Sir Harold Alexander. He had made his headquarters at the King of Naples' palace at Caserta, an hour's drive from the Gustav Line. This elegant atmosphere was a reflection of the man himself. Harold Macmillan, British resident minister out here, commented that the conversation at Caserta was more likely to be about classical architecture or the best way of driving pheasants in low country than about the war. Charming and popular, Alexander was a good choice to command the troops of a dozen nations who served under him in Italy. Macmillan wrote admiringly that he didn't give orders, but made suggestions. This relaxed, easygoing style was a great strength and a great weakness. Alexander couldn't control his American subordinate, General Mark Clark, commander of Fifth Army. Clark was aggressive and vain. His personal ambition was a flaw that would affect his military judgment. The distrust between these two men mirrored a wider Anglo-American divide over the whole worth of the Italian campaign. To the Americans, it was a sideshow, wasting men and ammunition. To the British, the struggle was occupying German troops who might otherwise be free to fortify Normandy. The Allies were pulling against each other, and this discord was to have terrible consequences. Churchill knew it was imperative to break the deadlock. He revived an ambitious plan for an amphibious landing at the little ports of Anzio and Nettuno. From there, the Allies could threaten the Gustav Line from behind. It will astonish the world, and it will certainly frighten Kesselring, Churchill declared. For a soldier, an amphibious landing by night is a risky business. Time and tide are crucially important, and bad weather can wreck things before the enemy even fires a shot. Troops are desperately vulnerable when they hit the beach, and thereafter they must depend upon the sea for resupply and reinforcement. 26-year-old Edward Grace was in one of the leading craft approaching Anzio.
We expected to get a right royal reception from the Germans. All the machine guns would open up at once as we approached the beach, and no doubt there would be a heavy artillery fire coming right down onto the navy, the ships, and also, no doubt, some of the shells landing right on top of us on the beach.
Fresh in the minds of the men heading for Anzio was the memory of the near disaster at Salerno the previous September. There, the Germans had lunged back instantly and almost pushed the Allies into the sea. But this time, the Germans should have their hands full on the Gustav Line. Just before the Anzio landing, they were to be distracted by an attack miles away on the Gustav Line. General Clark ordered his battle-scarred 36th Division, a Texas outfit, to cross the River Garry, 2 miles south of Cassino, and break into the valley beyond. The men had to make the crossing in lightweight assault boats made of wood and canvas. They constructed them at a safe distance from the river. The night of the 20th of January was wet and foggy. The Texans had to carry their boats almost 2 miles across a flooded minefield under shell and mortar fire. Then they had to paddle across the river, gain handholds on the far bank, and hang on until the engineers built bridges. The Garry may not look much of an obstacle, but it's deep and fast-flowing, especially when swollen by winter rains. Alarmingly, the Texan commander, Major General Fred Walker, privately thought that the mission was hopeless. He wrote in his diary,
"We might succeed, but I don't see how we can. The crossing is dominated by heights on both sides of the valley, where German observers are ready. Clark sent me his best wishes. I think he is worried over the fact that he made an unwise decision."
Clark was right to be worried. 900 Americans never even made it to the water. Some boats were damaged and sank. Others capsized as the men climbed in. A few were swept helplessly away.
I could hear the paddles slapping water and hitting together, and then the men yelling when their boat turned over. It curdled your blood to hear those men drown.
Amazingly, some of them made it across here, in boats, swimming, or on footbridges which were soon smashed. In the morning, the survivors sheltered in irrigation ditches or flooded foxholes. The Texans tried again that afternoon, but it was the same dreadful story. Eventually, the Germans, horrified by the scene, stopped firing and stacked the bodies up like driftwood. The Texas Division lost nearly 1,700 men. It was a write-off. Many Texans never forgave General Clark. One company commander told the reporter,
I had 184 men. 48 hours later, I had 17.